Good evening, Tom.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm all right under the circumstances that we're all suffering, but I'm fine.
Thank you for joining this new YouTube series, which I title War as Reset. Only 2 weeks ago, a month ago, we were into full COVID swing, and now it seems COVID is so far away. Actually, many wished the pandemic, COVID, was nothing more than a bad dream, a nightmare. The truth is that it is still a reality for most of the world's population as we speak. Many wish that the Russo-Ukrainian war is nothing more than a bad dream, a nightmare. But war is back in Europe. According to psychoanalysis, nightmares can only disappear when their meaning is represented. One could ask, why doing these series of interviews with authoritative Jungians in the middle of this crisis? Well, because those that watch my previous series, Breakfast at Kusnach Lockdown Therapy, always put at the center Jung thinking, post Jungian and neo Jungian studies, so that these are visible and audible for free to everyone. Also, because as your friend, our colleague Andrew Sambal suggested, within the both the microcosm of an individual and the macrocosm of the global village, we are floated by psychological themes, and that politics embodies the psyche of people. Also, Andrew said and actively demonstrated how useful and effective perspective derived from psychotherapy might be in the formation of policy, in new ways of thinking about the political process and the resolution of conflict. Therefore, Tom, I truly hope that this series will be an opportunity for depth because there is very little depth right now about what is going on, especially when we look at the medias. I hope this will be an opportunity for depth and contrast, even compensate the current media voyeurism, where we eat war on a daily basis, where war is an attraction to eat war. We are attracted by war. Maybe we'll talk about Wotan tonight. We wish war to be as far as possible, but at the same time, we want war to happen. And war, as a news from media outlets, is helping those media outlets to sell more and more advertisement, to keep us in front of it, but not necessarily to inform. We saw these the early phases of the pandemic and in many other times throughout recent history. I call this media bulimia, which reflects actually a spread collective paranoia, panic, and perhaps even selfishness. And just before to give you the floor, I want to show you the cover of the New Yorker this week. It's very symbolic, very emblematic. Is a tank on the snow. But if you look at it, almost 80 pages, only 20 are dedicated to the war. Well, obviously, this is easy. This issue was done, then war started, and they had to write about it. So it's not in depth, not even the New Yorker. But you can watch this on so many media, the BBC, the CNN. They keep vomiting information which repeat every half an hour for waiting and waiting for bigger news. What do you think?
Well, I think you said a whole lot in relatively few words. There are many different conversations that can be had simply from your opening statement. There's the bulimia of our thirst for information, but also exciting information, and exciting can mean awful as well as wonderful, but filled with excitement. So there's the bulimic attraction of the media, and then there's the nature of war and what is our thirst for war. I think they get conflated in your statement. They get conflated, but maybe we need to separate them out, because it's one thing to talk about what the war is in the Ukraine and what it's about, and then there's the kind of fascination and attraction and bulimia in response to war. Or I think actually we can't just say it's the media that's doing that to us. It's our psyche that the media is playing to, which is that hunger for excitement, the hunger for an entertainment. And the more we get exposed to it, the more dramatic it needs to be to kind of keep us stimulated. So there is something in us, at least in me, and I think in many, many people, that does get excited and turned on by images of destruction.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the New Yorker is. It's images of destruction. And we are excited by it. It speaks to something in the psyche that is horrifying. And we are excited by horror.
Yeah. Let's move on this. Somehow you asked the question yourself, but I want to do it for you again. What is war?
Well, again, I think that the war is about hostility. War is about, and there are of course many different kinds of wars. There's economic wars. There's cultural war. In the United States, we've been in the midst of a cultural war for some time. So there's war that involves open hostilities. There's the Cold War, in which the hostilities are ferocious, but they freeze everything into a fixed state. So war can be everything from open hostilities on a large scale to kind of the rivalries that groups of people feel with one another. In the United States, there's the Trumpites and the anti-Trumpites. We've been in a cultural war for some time now. So war is many different things and occurs at many different levels. The war that we're seeing now, of course, is one of open hostilities between rival nation states or large groups of people. That's only one kind of war.
Is war in our nation, in our nation, it's a nice Freudian slip, is war in our nature? And I think of Freud and aggressivity.
Freud and aggressivity. That of course, Freud said the unconscious was sex and aggression, and so and maybe war is even sex and aggression. There's certainly a lot of rape in war, and so sort of very primitive impulses from the psyche or from the unconscious are unleashed in war. And as human beings, there's no question that we have enormous aggression and we have enormous sexual interests and desires. So is it in our nature? I recently watched a wonderful, we're doing something through Eris called Gaia Then and Now, and in a recent presentation, Shoshana Firstman was reviewing the ancient goddesses of Europe and the Middle East, and she made an amazing statement. She said in all of the images that come from that era, which goes back to 40,000 BC up until maybe there are no images of war. And so the argument is, as I'm sure you're familiar, that when the mother goddess was supreme, there was no war, and it's only with the advent of the patriarchy that wars proliferate, and therefore it's a function of the masculine or the patriarchy. I'm not sure if I buy that argument, but I know that what's associated with the mother goddess is much more of a harmonious and peaceful nature related to death and rebirth in terms of the cycles of nature. Of course, the number of people. So I don't have a definitive answer to your question, but I know there are people who make the argument that the war belongs to the masculine and the patriarchy, and certainly over the last 2,000 years, there's ample evidence for that.
Yeah. Actually, my next question
I don't know whether prior to that, whether during the time of the goddess, whether war was also. I mean, if you look at India and you look at Kali, it seems that the Indian mythology shows Kali in her destructive mother aspect as being very warlike and devouring.
Yeah, well, we have examples of the Vikings, the female Vikings that were obviously warriors. But then the question, also following the title of the book of Nobel laureate Svetlana Alexievich, is war masculine? I think the novelty of this war is not that since maybe 20, 30 years, professional armies like the American army, even the European armies, have women into their battalions, even transgender into their battalion. And this could be seen as a sign of modernity. But what really touched me is to see layperson, not professional soldiers, my age, and not only men, but many, many women that went to get enlisted and to receive a machine gun and to fight to defend the country. As you know, we recently had a conversation for analysis and activism with one of our colleagues in Kiev, and he said, "I will not leave because I'm staying to defend my country." Many women are doing the same. In this very moment, in my flat here in Berlin, there are two families, two mothers, three kids. Their husbands are fighting. Yeah, so they flee because they have kids, but many women stayed. The mother of a patient of mine, a woman that is 70 plus, she said, "I'm not fleeing as the daughter fled because I have to stay here and help our soldiers." So this war is making war not only a masculine matter, but with traits that are feminine, and for me are really interesting. And maybe gave a switch to the masculine aggressivity of the fight.
You mean that the women pick up the fight, or
my fantasy is that joining the fight, that they might bring something that we men. That is not only the fight, actually something else than the fight.
There's an amazing statue which we saw recently when a young Russian colleague did a video of what he called Russian cultural complexes, and he argued that actually that Mother Russia, that the father is rather absent or impotent in Russia, and the real power comes from the mother. And there's a huge statue that he showed an image of with a bare-breasted woman, huge statue, I mean, towering statue, bare-breasted woman with a sword, a really big sword. So it does raise the question: is war simply a function of the masculine, or is it can be as much a function? Well, we're really talking about gender, men and women, or masculine and feminine. It gets very, very confusing. I think there are so many confusing issues that come up now. For instance, as you're talking about your flat and your patients, I'm sitting here in San Francisco. I'm halfway around the world, and we're totally absorbed in this story, but it's much further away from us in terms of what people are actually experiencing. We have to do it through the media and the bulimia and through our imagination, but the human piece of it, the human contact, we really don't have. So the experience in Europe is probably right now quite different than it is in the United States, I think. Although what you describe in terms of the women joining the fight for the freedom of Ukraine touches a very deep chord in our American history. And in some ways, I think the deep American response to the war in Ukraine is that it's actually renewing something of our own fight for the spirit of freedom that's quite different than the January 6th insurrection, which there are people in America who are fighting a different war. They want to reclaim the country in the name of a right-wing something or other, whereas the Ukrainian war speaks to, I think, a deeper yearning for freedom in the United States as well. We're having a big fight about what freedom is in the United States. And the war in Ukraine is actually beginning to unify us in many ways. It's
Let me
unifying much of the Western world. Yes.
let me take let me share my take on what is this war about.
Mm,
We Jungians, when we look at time, we differentiate between chronos and kairos. Chronos is the evolution of time, minute after minute, and kairos is, the universal time. I have a picture of Kaiser Franz Joseph in my studio, my office, which I bought in Vienna. And Kaiser Franz Joseph was the last, although not the really last, but the most important Kaiser before the collapse of the empire. And Ukraine, Galicia, the north of the empire, was these multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious experiments or opportunity that collapse with the beginning of the First World War. My fantasy, and it is a fantasy, it's not historical, so I hope historian will not scold me, but it's a fantasy that Kronos is intervening. And somehow following Shakespeare and philosopher Agnes Elleris, they talk about time is out of joint. So to set time in joint, but not to go back to 1914, but somehow to help history go back on the right track. What is my fantasy about this? The Ukrainians in the early 2000s and then in 2014 already demonstrated and fought for freedom, but not freedom for joining the West, McDonald's, beautiful libertine life. No, they're telling us we want to be part of a society where we can decide on our own about ourselves. We want, and we will touch upon this later, we want to be able to not be run by someone outside. We want to be able to decide. And what they are teaching us, and you Americans went through this experience through Trump, they want to build a country or live in a country where institutions don't fall, don't implode when something like you went through, Trumpism, happens. Trump and Biden, or the post-Trump, shows that although the many problems, ups and downs, the US democracy is healthy. Western European democracy are healthy. A bit sick, neurotic, but healthy. What they're telling us is we don't want to be under an autocrat. We want to be ourselves and develop more and more in this healthy democracy. This is why I'm going back to 1914, before Europe went at war, actually a war between Austrian-Hungarian, so also Ukrainian, and the Russians. But that was a war to build, because the Prussian wanted it more than the Austrian, to build the great Germany, to reunite everything against the Russian, also against the Bolshevik possible revolution. So I'm wondering if this lap back 100 years is part of that. What do you think?
Well, let me see if I understand you. Are you implying sort of war? I think I'm getting a sense of where you're going. War as reset, that the reset that you're fantasizing or imagining or hoping for would be that this war will allow a reclaiming of a true democracy in which people can choose how to live, and that the war in Ukraine really is about that for the Western world. That the is, of course, Ukraine didn't start this war, although and it was certainly not Putin's intention to mobilize this deep yearning for freedom. And I think maybe you're making the argument that the unconsciously the world is reacting for this war to be a reset in which the individual and group freedom is reaffirmed. Is that the argument you're making, or the fantasy you're having?
And freedom where institutions don't implode under attack. Institutions were about to implode in the US under the Trump years, but they stayed healthy with their ups and downs. We know about that. But the fact that Biden was elected, that anyone but Trump was elected, it means exactly this. The Ukrainians, perhaps in the collective sphere, are telling us this. Not just we want to go into NATO, we want to go there. No, we want to become our own leader, masters. We want to be able to follow our path. For me, it's interesting that, Mitteleuropa, it's where war started to 100 years ago, especially because one claims that then World War II was a compensation of having lost World War I. Is this war, somebody saying, compensation of the falling apart of the Soviet Union? Somebody saying that Putin wants to be the new Tsar, the new, Vladimir. Could it be that it is a compensation?
Well, yes, it certainly could be certainly the compensation, certainly the sense that Putin is motivated by the desire uh, uh, to reaffirm the potency of Russia, not even Soviet Russia, but Tsarist Russia. Uh, it becomes more convincing on a daily basis that maybe this is what he's all about. That it's a compensation for the collapse of the Soviet Union and his wish to reaffirm the depth of the Soviet soul and the sanctity of the Soviet soul, whatever. And of course, there are people who argue that it's more personal, that his own family suffered enormously during the siege of Leningrad, and that the West ignored his pretty persistent pleas not to extend NATO further east, and that he's been warning us for some time. There's so many different theories about what Putin's up to. But I want to get back to your idea that inadvertently Putin may have stimulated a reassertion of this basic principle of freedom in which democratic institutions survive, which I think you make a very good point there. That my only fear is I'm not so sure in the United States how stable they are. And I mean, we're still at war here. The Ukrainian war is a kind of diversion right now from the war going on in the United States, and it's a battle that is not over. That fight is the stability of democratic institutions in the United States has not been established as far as I'm concerned. That our war is ongoing in the United States.
Mm.
I want to go to Jung's Wotan, 1936,
Yeah.
which is a, a fascinating essay. I happen to love it, but it's also was the source of enormous problems for Jungians because many people read it as Jung's embracing Wotan, and that he himself was very excited by Wotan. And I think it's a misreading of the essay, but he writes with such passion that I understand how people could actually misread it in that way. But there's something he says in there, which for me, I've been listening to this for a long time. And I'm going to quote, it's a bit long, but I think it's worth introducing into the discussion. He said, archetypes are like riverbeds which dry up when the water deserts them, but which you can find again at any time. An archetype is like an old watercourse along which the water of life has flowed for centuries, digging a deep channel for itself. The longer it has flowed in this channel, the more likely it is that sooner or later the water will return to its old bed. The life of the individual as a member of society, and particularly as part of the state, may be regulated like a canal. But the life of nations is a great rushing river which is utterly beyond human control. The life of nations is a great rushing river which is utterly beyond human control. Thus, the life of nations rolls on unchecked, without guidance, unconscious of where it is going, like a rock crashing down the side of a hill until it is stopped by an obstacle stronger than itself. Political events move from one impasse to the next like a torrent caught in gullies, creeks, and marshes. All human control comes to an end when the individual is caught up in a mass movement. Then the archetypes begin to function, as happens also in the lives of individuals when they are confronted with situations that cannot be dealt with in any of the familiar ways. Now you're probably very familiar with that quote, but when you argue that war may be a kind of, in a way, may lead to a healthy, positive reset in terms of the reaffirmation of democratic ideals and institutions, I would say, well, I hope so too. But I remember Jung saying that the life of nations is a great rushing river which is utterly beyond human control. So we may project our wishes for what we hope will happen in this. But one of the reasons the United States, and I think the rest of the West, has been reluctant to go into Ukraine more forcefully is the fear that this is going to get out of control. I
Of
mean,
the
it
river.
is out of control.
Of the river. Let me respond to you. It's like a ping pong game with stations. This case is James Hillman, a terrible love for war. There is no practical solution to war because war is not a problem solvable by the practical mind, which is better equipped for its conduct than for its avoidance or conclusion. War belongs to our soul as an archetypal truth of the cosmos. It is a human work and an inhuman horror, and a love that no one love has been able to overcome. We can open our eyes to this terrible truth and, becoming aware of it, devote all our passionate intensity to undermining the enactment of war, strengthened by the courage that culture possesses, even in the dark ages, to continue to sing as it resists war. We can understand it better, postpone it longer, work to gradually remove it from the support of a hypocritical religion, but the war as such will remain until the gods themselves leave. The first
But
part
yeah,
now
go ahead.
answered the questions I asked you or shared, but the end, but the war as such will remain until the gods themselves leaves. Is like the end of a dream with a bad omen. By the way, didn't the gods left already since Nietzsche, since Freud?
Well, obviously, the gods, even though we may not call them that, are still very alive. Unfortunately, they've taken human form in our worship of celebrities. But if you think the gods are dead, you're wrong, because we're projecting godhood onto our celebrities. We make them into gods, I think, with the full projective power of the psyche. I don't think the gods are dead. I don't think the gods are dead. And I think that I think Hillman's pointing to war as being part of the archetypal core of our human nature. I I guess I take solace in that, because when I told you that wish that I had, or that thought I had with the World Trade Center going down, and finding some excitement in myself that horrified me as I witnessed that in me,
Yeah.
is that we are attracted to and fascinated by war, and it is archetypal, and it lives in all of us. I believe that. Some people are better at dealing with it and undermining its power uh, than others. And somebody like Putin, of course, I don't think he gives a goddamn. Excuse me, I don't think he cares. I think he loves war, and I'm sure there are many people in. Go
He
ahead.
loves war, and in fact, Illmans underlines love that no other love has been able to overcome. And
Hmm.
go back to my early point.
Hmm.
No, we eat war. War is an attraction. We need war. Even peace, somebody claimed, is a pause between wars. Tom, will it be total war in Europe?
Will there be total war of Europe? Well, I mean, that's the 64 billion or trillion-dollar question. Um, I think that really depends on one's assessment of Putin. I obviously, Putin isn't just himself. Putin is speaking for certainly at least the people close around him, and but I think the reason that the Western alliance, the NATO, have been reluctant, and certainly the United States, to up the ante, is the fear that there will be war in Europe. I don't think we know the answer to that. Do you have a prediction? Uh,
Well, I am less than 1,000 kilometers
yeah.
from Ukraine. Tension is growing. Um, Attraction is growing. Yeah. Um, I hope not, but we cannot. We are not in control of that. Only God knows whatever God
Yeah.
is and whatever we want God to be. I really think, and I wrote it in papers. Uh, we have hopes and expectation, but life goes in a different way than our hopes and expectations.
Yeah, I think right now, to me it's still unimaginable. I think it's unimaginable, but it's in the same way that the bombing of the World Trade Center was unimaginable until it happened. And I think that we need to keep in consciousness that it's a very real possibility. And I've been finding myself thinking, why aren't we sending airplanes into that no-fly zone? Why aren't we doing more to protect the Ukrainians? And that move could precipitate a much bigger war. And so I think the people who are holding in mind uh, the the very real possibility of this happening, I think we need to do that. Although it's not certainly in our control. I think. let me introduce one of the images that I have as a way of showing you how I think about these things. And if I can, I'm going to turn on my. It'll take me just a minute to get this image, and if we're lucky, we'll have it, and if not, I'll stop. But I'm going to try to do it by. First, I'm going to go to this thing, and I'm going to go to desktop and screensaver, and I'm going to click on this, and then I'm going to click on share screen, and let's see if that works. Is it coming on?
I see you.
Okay, wait, here, I got it now. Start sharing. Let's see if this works.
Oh no, it's black, like when we did the rehearsal.
Okay, I'm going to try it one more time, and then if it doesn't work, I'm going to not try it. Let's see. I'm going to try it one more time. It's so strange, but here we are. At least it's not a nuclear button that we're pressing. I guess it's not going to work. Well, let me just tell you a little bit about how I go ahead.
Before you tell me, go back. Go back from share screen so I can see your face.
Oh, okay.
Yes, you're back.
Okay, I'm back. So
what was the image about?
I want to tell you sort of how I structure this in my own mind, which may or may not be useful to you or other people. But as you know, I've spent the last 20 or so years thinking about what I call cultural complexes, and some in our tradition have picked up on this and found it useful, and others haven't. But when 9/11 happened, and then after that, George Bush and Osama bin Laden squared off against one another, I tried to imagine psychologically the structure of this conflict in terms of cultural complexes. And because when we try to think about this psychologically, you have the individual psyche and you have the personal psyche. And then you have the cultural psyche or cultural unconscious, and then you have the archetypal psyche. You have all these different layers of the psyche that tend to get engaged. And I think when these cultural complexes kind of reach a certain um, intensity, and in this case, one could say the Russian cultural complex of and Putin's personal complex of not feeling heard by the West in terms of NATO getting closer to the borders of Ukraine, or some people argue that that's just an excuse, that actually Putin was upset about in danger at home, and so he needed to create a war outside. We don't know Putin's personal motivations, but we do know that there's a long, well-established tradition or fear in Russia of encroachment from the barbarians of the West. And Gert Sauer wrote a beautiful essay in a book that we published called Europe's Many Souls on two cultural complexes. And he talks about the fear of the Russians about being invaded from the West, and of course that goes way back, and in Putin's own memory, the German invasion of Russia. So there's a very old Russian complex of being invaded from the West, and Putin has clearly been mobilizing the energies of that cultural complex to rally the Russian people and the defense of the motherland behind him. All of the propaganda has been mobilized around that Russian cultural complex. And of course, the West has responded with our belief in democracy and freedom and the passionate energies that get mobilized around that. And so when you get that going on, you have the spirit or the godhead even of these two different forces, Mother Russia and democratic West. And at the core, then you get these, it's like the spiritual home of the two groups are being threatened. And when they're threatened like that, you get these huge defensive energies, what I call archetypal defenses of the group spirit, which get mobilized. And then you have this ferociously destructive energies that get unleashed. And so I tend to formulate this for myself in terms of long-standing cultural complexes with memories of their own, emotions of their own, narratives of their own, very simplistic ideas, black and white ideas that take hold of everybody, and that it becomes supercharged. And when you get these, what I call cultural complexes and their archetypal defenses of the group spirit mobilized, God knows where it's going to end up, because you have the threat of thermonuclear war undermining or in the background of all of it.
Yeah.
So, and I don't think you and I can answer where this is going to go.
No.
Uh,
No. No. I think we simply have to learn to accept. Yeah. Let me ask you the question about. Yeah, you want to go on? Go on, Tom.
Well, then then the question is, do we put our energies behind peace, or do we put our energies behind war? If we put our energies behind war in defending the archetypal spirit, the group spirit, and we join with our colleague in Zelensky in Ukraine, we do everything we can to fight and kill the Russians. We send our airplanes over Ukraine, and we intensify the war in the defense of freedom. On the other hand, if we put our energies on the side of peace, we refrain from further escalating the war, and so, which way do we go? And in a way, we have a personal choice to make. Do we escalate and think that Putin is bluffing, or do we try to de-escalate or at least contain and limit the fight?
Yeah, it's interesting again to refer to World War One, when both the emperors, or the Austrian-Hungarian emperor and the Tsar, didn't want war. But then war was inevitable because their armies were in front of each other for months, waiting for war. And their armies had no war for 50 years. And to have an army of that standing without war, then it gets into alcoholism, prostitution, gambling. And we know this is another reason why the Austrian Empire ended. Last question about war, because it is clear that war turns normal people into beasts. What is your opinion about those non-Ukrainians, Europeans, North Americans, who have enlisted and are traveling to Ukraine? Are they heroes, poors, suicidal, hopeful Davids against Goliath, idiots?
Well, I imagine there are some of all of those. What comes to mind is it comes to mind is Steven Spielberg made a film about Munich. It was an unbelievable film, and I got transfixed by it. And one of the things that really interested me was his study of the main character Avner, who was appointed by Golda Meir to go and assassinate the terrorists, the Black September group. And as the film progresses, Avner becomes more and more of a beast, more and more inhuman. I think, in my way of thinking about these things, he got possessed by the archetypal defense of the group spirit. He no longer is an individual. He becomes identified with the spirit of the group, say of democracy,
Yeah.
and he takes on that identity, and he becomes a killer. And I think that I think a possession by that kind of archetypal energy is maybe at the core of some of these people, maybe many people who get gripped by this. Obviously, the Ukrainians are defending their homeland. The people who are coming in from outside, they're being possessed by that uh, same spirit. Are they heroic? Are they inflated? Are they puers? I don't know if we can answer that. We just know that they're possessed by a very powerful spirit. Is that spirit good or bad? Was the spirit of being possessed by the wish to defeat Hitler good or bad?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question as a psychotherapist, a medical doctor, psychiatrist. Many media outlets are psychopathologizing Putin. Many media outlets did it with Trump. I mean, they can do it. They did it with Boris Johnson, with everyone, with the bad guys. Is it useful?
Well, it depends on what your purposes are. If you want to mobilize the feelings of people to rally around the Ukrainians, it's very useful. Uh, in the case of Trump, and as you know, I contributed to a book called "The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump," and I wrote an essay for that book. And the difference between Trump and Putin is that with Trump, we had information about Trump going way back. Trump has been in the public eye for a long time. His exploits, his escapades, his bullying, all of his stuff. So we had and his statements. We had a lot of information
Yeah.
that we could make diagnoses on Trump. Putin, we don't know. We don't know. We don't have the same kind of information that we had about Trump. I think it's a mistake to try and diagnose Putin. I don't think we have the information, and
And could be part of what we described at the beginning as media voyeurism or media bulimia, you know, finding a reason to spot the bad guy.
yeah. Well, in these kinds of conflicts, everything breaks down to good and evil, and everything becomes black and white. And so, diagnosing or psychopathologizing
Is a proof
Putin,
of the bad guy.
yeah, he's the bad guy. But in today's world, if you can make a diagnosis, psychopathologize them, then that's kind of further evidence that they're being evil. That's why many psychiatrists objected to using diagnostic labels with Trump, because they felt it made mental illness bad. It conflated mental illness with Trump or mental illness with Putin, and that gives a bad name to mental illness. So there was that side of things. Uh, I have a colleague who called Putin a malignant narcissist, and I don't know where she came up with that. I've seen other people refer to him as a sociopath. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. I don't think it's useful right now to diagnose Putin. It's in the same way that it's very useful to diagnose Trump.
No. And it's not a diagnosis for me. He's a cold-blooded killer.
Yeah,
But now you can't diagnose the cold-blooded killer. But
yeah,
anyway, another
yeah,
question about Trump. We already touched upon Putin's desire to bring together people of the same origin, the Russians, the Slavs, and of course to get his hands on important geostrategic areas. He blamed Lenin 20 days ago live on TV. You know, he blamed Lenin for the current crisis and for the autonomy of Ukraine. To be historically correct, it was not Lenin, it was his predecessor, Yeltsin, who signed independence of Ukraine and not limited to Ukraine. And it was Yeltsin who took power after Gorbachev was ousted with a coup in summer 1991. My question is because Gorbachev didn't fight. He didn't want to spread blood. He didn't want a civil war. He understood. It was it for him. But, and we know Yeltsin was a drunkard. Maybe he was the narcissist. Yeah, he wanted to get power. Maybe he was compensated something. I wonder what would Russia and Europe be like today if Gorbachev had been allowed to continue his work?
Well, I think we can't help but wonder if following the collapse of the Soviet Union, when we were so hopeful for a real end to the Cold War and a real reconciliation, if some other leader or leaders now weren't there, that Gorbachev would be a good example. I guess you have to wonder if there's something in the Russian psyche that's so used to autocratic leaderships that it couldn't have, Russia may not have functioned, not just the Soviet Union, but Russia may not have functioned without Putin and the oligarchs coming in and taking control of things, because the Russian people are so used to having autocratic rulers. I don't know. That's at the level of the collective psyche. Is there something in the collective psyche of the Russian people that has been used to autocratic leaders for how many hundreds of years, whether that's just their fate as a people to have these tyrannical despots taking hold? We could certainly imagine a very different Russia with a very different leader. We can. It doesn't have to. It didn't have to go this way. That's what's so upsetting. It didn't have to go this way. You look at Ukraine, and it did, and what they've been doing as they've moved more towards not so much capitalism but democracy. But then maybe that's our own belief in the exceptionalism of democracy. But I don't know the answer to your question, but you can't help wonder
Yeah.
whether it all could take a different course with a different kind of leadership.
Yeah. Well, I propose this conversation to be titled War as a Reset because, as you might remember, in 2008, Obama proposed a total reset with Russia. And there is a gag between Hillary Clinton and Lavrov. They meet, and she says, "I have a present from President Obama. I have a present from President Obama." And it was a button, not a nuclear button, but a reset button. They laugh, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, it didn't work. It didn't work. My sociological godfather, Professor Mauro Magatti, recently wrote on an Italian newspaper called Avvenire. By bringing war back to the heart of Europe, Putin has definitively broken the global liberal order that arose after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Then Magatti pointed out that Putin intends to test the West resistance. So distant we are from what German sociologist Ulrich Beck, who pointed out that the declaration of independence must be transformed into a declaration of interdependence. Cooperate or die. And these, we propose, Beck said, must be on a global scale, because the traumatic vulnerability of all and the consequent responsibility for all, including one's own survival. Beck says that nationalism is particularly toxic. So he proposed a cosmopolitan perspective. But let me add more, because I had many interviews, conversation about COVID. A book will be published later this summer titled Lockdown Therapy. And in this conversation and in this book, I propose, or I had hope, we believe that the pandemic, which has exposed all of us to profound uncertainty, could prove to be an opportunity for change and new beginnings, an opportunity to decelerate, to reflect and realize that nature intended for us to move from the external world to the internal world, from extraversion to introversion, then to the interiority of the soul. So to be able later to return to the outside and maintain an inner-outer balance. We hope that the post-COVID challenge to be moving from a world based on hopes and expectation, so the linear world, to one where interiority and spirituality, even if not necessarily religious, are once again contemplated, so that something new can truly begin to sprout, namely the creativity of the soul. So in this case, authentic creativity, creative imagination is what is lacking in a modern society like ours, where creativity and creative imagination add fluidity, pluralism, and if fluidity rather than individualization and liquidity is fostered, there will be a chance to counteract anxiety, depression, suicidality, and thus anomie. I was aware when I wrote this, when I said this in the past 2 years, of the risk of being perceived naive. And that Michel Houellebecq prediction 2 years ago, the world will be the same, only a little worse, actually is turning out to be true. Now I know he was right. I am naive. So behind COVID, which has brought Europe to its knees, and now war, which will bring Europe even more to its knees, despite the next generation EU, the money that the European Union is putting into our countries, what is there? First, the certainty that I am naive. What is there? Conspiracy theory? China? I also suggested these in the past 2 years. Every time there is a pandemic, there is a change of empire. Europe was the empire before the Spanish flu, and then the US that caused it and brought it to Europe became the empire. My prediction is that China, who caused and brought COVID to Europe, the US, and the globe, will become the next empire, the next leaders. Do they want this war? In theory, not, because the US and Europe buy a lot of their stuff. But one might wonder, am I naive, Tom?
Well, that's a wonderful, complex statement, and I have so many thoughts and responses to it. Um, are you naive? Well, you see, I think when we imagine these things, we sort of tend to think in binary terms. It's either going to be this way or that way. And so either this is going to be the COVID will be an opening for a new renewal and creativity through introversion. I found myself during COVID. I've written 2 articles recently or on creativity in individuals who responded to COVID in a wonderfully creative way, and so I've been witnessing this kind of creativity as a result of COVID. Now, so so of course the Egyptians, I think, how many thousands of years ago knew that plagues and war, pestilence and war go hand in hand. That's an old phenomena. Does that mean a reset in a positive way, or does it mean a regression and going back to something even worse? Well, maybe it means both.
Mm.
Maybe there are things that are happening that we can't see that are very creative, leading to the kind of interdependence that you're talking about in the most positive sense. Jerome Bernstein talks about the tension between dominion and receptivity, and he's kind of arguing for a new balance between dominion and receptivity. Well, clearly Putin right now is on the side of dominion. It's all about dominion. On the West, what we're tending to talk about, what you're talking about, I think, is the hope for a kind of new receptivity among the Ukraine, interdependence and receptivity among the Ukrainian people, maybe inspiring all of us in the West. So I don't think you're naive. I think that's one pole, the wish for something creative and new and receptive and interdependent to come out of these crises is one possibility, and I think regression is another possibility, and maybe both of them go on simultaneously. So we're in the fog of war and we don't know where it's going.
Mm.
And so I would say both and actually, and I'm not trying to be a good Jungian or a good Hegelian in saying that. I just can feel both potentials.
True, because actually the question is, for me as a European, will Europe hold out from an identity point of view, a psychological point of view, a financial level? And if it will resist, will it be because the Ukrainian, as we said before, have taught us and remember what freedom is? But there is an important point brought by Brian. He underlined what seems to be certain is that, looking at COVID, we have been living in a time of massive abaissement de niveau mental brought about by COVID-19. The abaissement is prodrome of changes that can be positive and negative, but always functional to a new psychological adaptation to reality. This is exactly what you said. It's not good or bad, either or. Is transformation. Transformation is, we human beings with our values make it positive or negative, but per se is not.
I think the old solutions to the problems we're facing don't work. And we're going to need new solutions to the problems we're facing. And I think they are in the realm of interdependence and receptivity, and reciprocity is the term that Jerome Bernstein uses. And is there a new kind of reciprocity that's happening, or a renewed reciprocity that's happening between us as we discuss things, as Biden's getting ready to fly to Europe, as what's going to happen with China? We don't know what China's going to do. It's terrifying to think that the terrifying side of this is to think that there's a new axis forming between China and Russia, and that we're really being set up for a really ugly 20, 30 years of confrontation between a Western axis and a Russian Chinese axis. That's terrifying. That's the most terrifying thing to think is coming out of this. Does China lend money and arms to Russia, and the two of them unify in a kind of battle against the Western world, like Germany and Japan?
Yeah, yeah.
New
But,
axis.
but let me ask you a difficult question now, because you're an intellectual, you're American, you're Jewish, your ancestors were Germans. What is the difference between this war and the crap perpetrated by the US since the end of Second World War? Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. What about the US invasion and occupation of political destabilization under the guise of liberating them? And since 91, under the pretext of spreading liberal democracy. Maurizio Ferrara, journalist at Corriere della Sera, looks at the US invasion of Iraq and underlines that, quote, some commentators observe that it was a predetermined carnage, just like that of the last 10 days in Ukraine, which took place after months of preparation. Maurizio Ferrara underlines us that Nobel Prize Nobel Prize for Literature Svetlana Alexievich has drawn a very clear picture of the imperiality impulses, not only of Putin, but also of a large part of Russian population. We underlined it. She called it the Homus Sovieticus. What about the imperialist impulses of the US? Apart from the US, every time the British invaded and occupied a country, they created problems, civil wars, once they left. Look at Kenya, Cyprus, Palestine. They still occupy part of Ireland, actually. Are the action of the British Crown and the death they caused any different than those of Stalin, the US, or Putin? When colonial British occupied countries and took everything from them, or the capitalist US invaded countries for geopolitical reasons for their goods. Ferrara again underlined, the war in Iraq gave an important shock to Europe. In the wake of the massive streets demonstration, and I was in the streets in London, it was March 2003. In the wake of the massive street demonstration, two great European intellectuals and philosophers, Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida, asked themselves the question, what binds Europeans together with respect to the international order? Their answer was a political mentality different from the American one and based on some common traits. An aversion to the use of force, first of all, and therefore an insistence on law and respect for international legality. Support for a global system based on liberal multilateral institutions and on human rights. Fruit of a past inspired by opposite principle and characterized by centuries of bloody carnage. Precisely this mentality had to push Europe to build a foreign and security policy anchored to the EU, overcoming the stupid and simplistic opposition between war and peace. It is for this reason that Europe has looked the other way until now with respect to Ukraine? Question mark. Let me explain. Why does Ukraine not share those values outlined by Habermas and Derrida, or does Ukraine share those values outlined by Habermas and Derrida? If so, why don't we let them become part of the European Union? Are they too much homos Sovieticus? Bear with me, we just finished. Maurizio Ferrara also underlines that the Slovenian philosopher Jacques said recently, Putin feels himself the patriarch of an organic community in which being free means staying in one's place. Alexander Dugin, the Russian president court philosopher, convinced Putin, that truth consists in what one believes. This is the toxicity of nationalism and of authoritarian regimes. If, Zizek continues, the United States don't believe Russian truth, the war must be made to decide. But what to say to the Ukrainian people, Zizek rightly wonders? It is not entitled to its own truth? Or is Ukraine merely a battlefield for the use of those who want to rule the world? The division into spheres of influence is still a fact of the contemporary international system with which we must reckon. Europe should follow its vocation and act through diplomacy and mediation, continues Maurizio Ferrara. However, when war is an established fact on our borders, the strategy also changes. I personally think that we Europeans should be grateful to the United States, the Russians, and the British for liberating Europe from Nazism. Do you remember the movie? You were talking about Spielberg's Munich, but what about Roberto Benigni's Life is Beautiful? It ends with the American tanks entering a concentration camp and liberating. Well, Auschwitz was liberated by the Russian, Bergen-Belsen by the British, and Mauthausen by the Americans. Yeah. So the three of them liberated Europe. We have to be grateful to the American, the Russian, and the British for having liberated Europe from the Nazism. Indeed, even the idea of the Great Germany that inspired the Prussian before World War I and Hitler's idea before World War II was about limitless. And the idea about Russia today is, again, limitless, borderless. But also the idea of 18th century and 19th century Britain was about borderless. That's why they went to Africa and everywhere else. The Commonwealth as a big hypocrisy. And with the end of the Second World War, helped the Americans to put forward their path. In a nutshell, why do we always look away from our own countries when we're looking for the bad one? Why is it so easy to look at problems when they come from the other side of the war? Why are the Russian or the Chinese or the Taliban the bad guys? In the 90s, the bad guys were the Libyans and the Iranians. In the 90s, the Iraqis took their place. By the way, we sold them, or we armed them, actually. And in 2000, the Muslim became the threat. Now again, the Russian, like in James Bond movies. The answer is easy, and the answer can be found in Jung's paper After the Catastrophe. What do you think about this big rant I made, which is provocative because you're American, because you're Jewish?
I think it's beautiful. I think it's beautiful. I think it's a beautiful rant. It's not really a rant. I wish I could show the image I have of Chester Arnold's, this great big ball rolling down a hill, which is made up of bits and pieces of all different kinds of things. And what you just said is made up of bits and pieces of many different ideas, conflicting ideas, complementary ideas. And that's what we're faced with when we try to think about these problems in a human way. There's so many bits and pieces that get folded into one another. Is America or Germany or Great Britain? Are we just like Russia with our own imperialist, colonialist agendas? And are we just as bad as they are? One thing that happens, I know, when you activate cultural complexes, things become black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly in groupthink, when large groups of people get rolling on an issue, the emotions run high and the thinking runs low. And and then people like you and I and our colleagues, we go into overdrive trying to resolve all of these complexities and all of these conflicting ideas. And we probably drive ourselves a little bit crazy because, as Jung said, and I don't usually go to Jung and quote him, but when the archetypal forces get rolling and the life of great nations get rolling, they're beyond human control. That's what this all feels like. You're asking great questions for which there's no clear answer, and God, I don't even know what I want to say. All human control comes to an end when an individual is caught up in a mass movement, and the unconscious is crashing down the side of a hill until it is stopped by an obstacle stronger. What's the obstacle going to be that stops this madness? I'm sure Europe knows a lot more about these things than the United States. We're a young country. We're a naive country. We tend to split things into black and white along with the best of them. Vietnam was a disaster. Iraq was a disaster. World War II, we can still hold up as a model of being good citizens. Right now, I think the West is kind of united in thinking that somehow coming in whatever form to Ukraine's aid, we're being good citizens. It's so these things just fluctuate with history and with our own ideas. And I think what you were doing in that long, quite brilliant sort of putting together all these different ideas, I don't think they're all valid. And many, go ahead.
Yeah, they are all valid. And if I can add with a little bit of inflation to what Habermas and Derrida said, perhaps this conflict is reminding us that Europe, after colonialism, after World War One, World War II, is about the co-construction of meaning. Your friend Jürgen says it many times.
Yeah.
Europe is very important because of these. And this leads me back to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which was not perfect. It imploded for many reasons that were not just about First World War, but this co-construction of meaning where you have different people, different languages, different religions worked. Of course, then at the end it became chauvinistic because at the end of empire, if the old king, the old emperor don't die and there is no new energy, it imploded. But I think Europe is very much about co-construction of meaning. And perhaps this crisis is also helping the European politicians to become together, to become ones for the first time, to become one for the first time.
Yeah, Jürgen and I co-edited a book called Europe's Many Souls. I really followed Jörg's lead in this in most ways because he's had a lifelong dream as a German, as an Austrian after World War II to really bring true and deep reconciliation among the different countries of Europe. And he worked very hard for this personally and really believed in the co-creation of meaning. And the one that he saw wasn't one in which it's a homogenous one. It was one with many different meanings, many different ways of different countries living together with different histories and traditions. That's been Jörg's dream. I know he's just been suffering enormously because I think he's personally seen this lifelong dream of a co-creation of meaning collapse. Now, maybe in fact, it's not a collapse. This is actually a way for it to kind of get reignited. But what happens to Russia in that the problem is now Russia's the bad guy and Western Europe's the good guy. And that's not really somehow Russia has to be part of that co-creation of meaning, I think. Don't you? I mean,
Well, you see, this is the very last point. I decided not to, but because you offered to me, we have to remember that Tsar Nicholas II and King George V were first cousins. They looked like identical twins. There are pictures of them when one puts on the uniform of the other army. And you wouldn't know who was Nicky or Georgie. But when the revolution came, Georgie decided not to help Nicky. So he didn't send boats and the army to at least rescue the family. So it also mean, well, life happens. Maybe this is also part of the Russian cultural complex. When Europe was supposed to save us from the revolution, it didn't. And that created the fact that Russia moved east, becoming less European. Could be.
Well, our collective identities in times like this become much more powerful than our individual identities, and it's terrifying and awesome to see us all caught up in our kind of collective identities and how divisive that can be. And yet at the same time we're hoping somehow that there'll be a collective identity which can have unity and separateness kind of in one Europe or even one world, if you can imagine such a thing. I salute you for taking on these monstrous issues with such diligence and passion. I really want to thank you for uh, asking these kinds of questions. And anybody that seriously tries to answer them will end up more befuddled than not. But
No. Well, thank you. I don't think so, because I think today we did exactly what we wanted, to add more depth to a very difficult topic, to show that analytical psychology, Jung, post-Jungian, neo-Jungian studies are very helpful to understand what is going on, and hopefully, yeah, can help also perpetuate co-construction of meaning.
Well, hats off to that. I believe in the co-construction of meaning, and I believe in what Jerome Bernstein is talking about, a new a new dialectic between dominion and reciprocity, which acknowledges that on the dominion side of things, there's man developing technologies which can improve the world and psychologies which offer greater understanding, but the reciprocity side is the real exchange and interdependence of that. That's what we're hoping for, and I think I
Thank you
ah,
for this long conversation. I hope people will enjoy this.
well, I certainly enjoyed talking with you, Stefano. Thank you very much for asking me to join in this most difficult conversation.